Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special joint hearing of the Public Works Gang Reduction and Budget and Finance Committees. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of Budget and Finance, joined by my colleagues Mr. Kretz, Mr. Bond, and Mr. Blumenfield. Mr. Buscaino, it's a pleasure to be with you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Krikorian. It's great to be joined here with you and your committee, along with members of the Public Works and Gang Reduction Committee. I have here present Councilwoman Martinez and Council members Rue and O'Farrell. Thank you all for joining us.
And I guess first we should see whether we have any general public comment cards. Are there any general public comment cards?
No, sir, there are no
general public comment is closed. That brings us then, Mr. Buscaino, to items 1 and 2, and if it's agreeable to you and to our members, I would propose that item 2 is appropriate for consent approval. Unless members have questions or concerns, this is the reporting back of the ordinance encapsulating the policy that has previously been dealt with.
Mr. Chair, we
Yes.
have cards on item number 2.
Okay, there are cards.
And I have a few questions.
Okay, so then we'll go ahead.
Hold that on the desk.
Shall we go ahead and proceed in order then?
Yes.
All right, then let's go ahead and call item number 1.
Item number 1 is a joint Bureau of Engineering and City Administrative Officer report relative to recommendations for a city-wide sidewalk repair incentive and cost-sharing rebate program.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Gary Lee Morris, City Engineer.
David Hirano with the Office of CAO.
Ted Jordan, Public Works General Counsel.
Council members, if you'd like, I can walk you through the report very briefly.
I think it would be helpful if you give a brief overview, yes.
Sure. We're asking that you establish an incentive and cost-sharing rebate program for the sidewalk repair program with a cap of $2,000 per lot in residential areas and a $4,000 cap in non-residential, commercial, and industrial areas. Additionally, we're asking property owners participating in this voluntary program be required to cover the cost of planting and establishing each street tree that must be removed, and that the city would be responsible to plant the additional tree and maintain it. With that, I'll walk through a little bit about the program that we have for you today. Once again, I want to emphasize that it is a voluntary program, and if you don't want to participate in this program, the city will be responsible to come through and repair your sidewalk during the 30-year period of time. But it's a wonderful program that it gives residents an opportunity, if they want to share and get the sidewalk fixed sooner in a 50-50 manner here. And this is a rebate only, and it's provided after the work is completed. And the way we've established the program is that we will be using our 311 system. And I definitely want to, at this time, thank the fellow departments and bureaus that have worked with us. Obviously, the council offices have worked with us very closely, the mayor's office, the city attorney, the Bureau of Street Services, the Bureau of Contract Administration, and our Information Technology Agency have all been extremely helpful in working with the CAO and Bureau of Engineering in preparing today's report. We would be using our 311 system as the intake system for all of the requests. Since that's our intake system right now for anybody who's reporting a sidewalk that needs to be fixed. So we're not adding a new system, we'll just expand the 311 system, have an application. Upon receiving that request, we'll be determining the eligibility, meaning that the property ownership and taxpayer identification information will need to be provided, and those businesses that are delinquent with business taxes will not be eligible for this incentive program. Once we've verified that it is indeed the property that's the ownership, we'll then go out and inspect the sidewalk, and we'll provide a cost estimate. It's important to note that the entire sidewalk in the property must be ADA compliant to qualify for the incentive. So that's very important, that you can't just do a section of your sidewalk, but the entire lot will actually have to be in ADA compliance. From there, once we provided that estimate to you, you'll have up to 60 days to have a licensed contractor obtain what we say is a no-fee A permit from the Bureau of Engineering. I think it's important at this time that I do talk about why we said a licensed contractor. This work is going to be warranted by the City of Los Angeles, 20 years for residential and 5 years in industrial and commercial. So we want to make sure that the work is done properly. Once again, if we were doing the work, we'd be using licensed contractors. And since we're sharing in the cost and we have to warranty it, we propose that it would be a licensed contractor required. I also, so that's why we proposed the licensed contractor. Once the permit has been obtained, the contractor then has 90 days to complete the work. The city will then inspect the work and issue a certificate of ADI compliant work, and that will start the warranty period. The city will then, upon that, will do the reimbursement. In the opening on the recommendations, street trees. Right now in the Board of Public Works, the policy is on a 2-to-1 basis for non-protected trees. And in this program, since we're basically, and I'll get into the cost of how we came up with it, but once again, we said in sharing the 50-50, we said the property owner would be responsible for replacing the tree if it had to be removed. Not that it's going to be removed, but they would be responsible for one tree, and the city would take on the responsibility for planting and maintaining the second tree. And finally, in closing, is the cost. How did we come up with the cost for this incentive program? Staff went out and looked at about almost 400 residential properties, and these residential properties they averaged about 45 feet frontage, 5-foot width sidewalk. Applying the dollar amounts that we've seen using our contractors to do the city facilities, it averaged about $32 a square foot. And some of these things included in that were the actual sidewalk repair, if we had to repair the driveway, curb and gutter, some tree pruning, and some tree removal. But on an average, it worked out to about $32 a square foot. And seeing what we saw in this sample set, the average cost was approximately $4,000, and thus 50% is $2,000 is how we came up with the $2,000 residential cap. We then went ahead and surveyed about 400 plus commercial and industrial properties, and what we saw there was an average frontage of about 100 feet, and with that, we went ahead and doubled the rebate to $4,000 for non-residential properties. And that's a very brief summary of our report in front of you.
Thank you, Mr. Gary Lee Moore. Appreciate the presentation, and do want to recognize all the team players here at the table and behind you who put together this comprehensive report. Colleagues, before you on both committees, you have substitute recommendations for the BOE and the CAO report, and then I ask that we approve these substitute recommendations for committee action, and just note that we would need a second for each of the committees. And if I can have Mr. Clerk read those recommendations.
The substitute recommendations for the Bureau of Engineering City Administrative Officer Report. Number 1, approve the establishment of an incentive for a cost-sharing rebate program for removal and replacement of concrete sidewalk with a cap of $2,000 per lot in residential areas R5 zone and more restrictive, and $4,000 per lot in commercial and industrial areas. Number 2, approve that property owners participating in the cost-sharing rebate program should be required to cover the cost for planting and establishing each replacement tree on their property for any that must be removed due to sidewalk repair. Number 3, instruct the Bureau of Street Services to report after the incentive program queue is full and the initial inspection of tree-related repair work on all incentive properties has been assessed, with a budget request for the city to establish additional off-site street trees as mandated by city policy. Number 4, instruct the Board of Public Works to implement a sidewalk repair program that reflects the cost-sharing rebate program described in this report. Number 5, instruct the board to report prior to the end of the fiscal year with recommendations to encumber any unspent incentive program funds for sidewalk repairs under the Access Request Program or adjacent to city facilities. Number 6, authorize the board to delegate specific elements of the program implementation, where appropriate, to a designee.
And I'll go ahead and move that also on behalf of Budget and Finance, Mr. Buscaino.
Thank you.
Is there a second? Seconded by Mr. Bloomfield.
And we have a second Public Works, so Mr. O'Farrell, thank you so much for the second.
Mr. Kretz.
Yeah, it's unclear to me whether this motion funds the 2-for-1 tree replacement as part of this.
Could I just have the clerk repeat this, I guess, the fourth?
I'm sorry, which item?
The motion you just read?
One of the recommendations, I believe, number
Okay. I just got a copy.
Number 3, actually. I think it's
Actually, number 3.
Number 3,
Is the report, here,
Oh,
go
2
ahead,
and
I'm
3.
sorry.
oh, no problem. Number 3, instruct the Bureau of Street Services to report after the incentive program queue is full and the initial inspection of tree-related repair work on all incentive properties has been assessed, with a budget request for the city to establish additional off-site street trees as mandated by city policy.
So initially, the policy would be that the incentive provides funding for one of the trees, the homeowner, property owner provides the funding for the other tree. Is that how you had indicated, Mr. Moore?
That's correct. And actually, we've allotted up to $500 as part of their maximum rebate for assistance with their tree, or tree trimming, or tree root pruning.
So how does that work indefinitely? The wording of this makes it sound like the first round we pay for the 2-for-1 or pay for half of it, and after that it isn't funded? Or is this a commitment to do our half of the 2-for-1 indefinitely as part of the program?
Let me see here. The way it is right here is to instruct the Bureau of Street Services to report back after the incentive is full in the initial inspection of the tree root. I guess I would interpret this in, and anybody can assist me with the clarity, is that we would hold on the second tree planting.
Yeah, I mean,
yes.
I guess the simple way of putting it is we can't really assess what the cost of that would be until the program begins and there's some inventory done of how many people are taking advantage of this program. So the point of number 3 is to bring it back as an ordinary budget request. We consider that in the context of the larger budget once we have a sense of some way to put a cost on it.
So we're not committing to it without a dollar amount.
We're not committing to it at all. We're committing to a fixed amount of incentive per property and a fixed amount for tree work per property. But the issue of payment for the second tree would await another day when we can make an intelligent decision about what the cost of that would be and how much additional resources that would require, which we would do in the ordinary budget process with the strength of this report.
That makes me a little nervous, because we're not talking about doing that with sidewalk repair and possibly not repairing sidewalks. We shouldn't be talking about that in terms of the trees either. It's a truly critical environmental piece. It's probably most important to do whatever we can to avoid taking mature trees out. But if we take them out and we don't even replace them 2-for-1 with scrawny young trees at best, we're going to definitely generate much more of a heat island effect in the city. And we're already expecting to hit a point where we're 3 to 4 times more heat days than we have now And it'll probably come more quickly than our estimates because everything else has with climate change. So I think that's possibly the most critical element of how we do this sidewalk repair. And so we won't know the dollar amounts, but I think committing to actually doing it is pretty critical.
So just to make sure we're all clear that what we're discussing now is only the incentive program. The larger sidewalk program is the second matter, but we're talking about the incentive program, and we have right now no way to quantify who's going to take advantage of that or not, how many, whether anybody does, or whether it's fully, subscribed within 6 months, like the last time we did this, it was. So that's the reason for doing this judiciously at the start. And this is the voluntary program. This is not the mandatory program that will be the subject of item number 2.
Mr. Chair, I have a question.
Ms. Martinez?
So I understand we all want our fair share, and there's a real question on how large the rebate program is going to be funded, and I guess we can take that up during the budget discussion. But however, my question is regarding equity as it relates to the sidewalks and willets. Not all communities will be able to take advantage or can even afford the rebate program. Will this program keep track of neighborhoods who are able to take advantage of it, and those neighborhoods whose properties are going to be on the waiting list? Just in case the program gets oversubscribed, how are you going to be able to address the equity issue?
We had proposed, and what we have before you today is that it would be on a first-come, first-served basis. We didn't divide it up in any other manner than first-come, first-served as it comes into the system. We'll, of course, be able to provide you information about those who take advantage of the program. We'll be able to map it. We'll be able to show you where individuals are taking advantage of the program, and we can provide you updates to that.
Yeah, what I don't want to see happen is that we inadvertently create concentrations of repairs and leave other districts and neighborhoods in a disadvantage when it comes to sidewalk repairs. That's what I don't want to see. And I think we need to be cognizant of that. What I would like to see, Mr. Chairs, is ask the CLA's office to work with the CO and the BOE in addressing this sidewalk repair program as we move forward as it relates to equity. We need to ensure that we're not inadvertently creating neighborhoods that are never going to see repairs because they simply cannot afford to, even with a rebate program. I want to ensure that happens, and that my comments are reflected in as we move forward, and it's reflected in the committee notes when this comes to the council. Is that clear?
I'm okay with that. Yes, okay with that.
Yeah, and I think just, again, to reiterate that point, I think all of us understand this to be a program that will not cause any delay in the larger mandatory sidewalk repair program. That process will go forward and would not either be delayed or dissipated because of the money involved in this program in any way. And that, equity is built in very clearly into the larger program. This incentive program provides people an opportunity to stretch the public dollars and help with private dollars in order to get some sidewalks done in the meantime, but it will not, under any circumstances, delay the implementation of the larger program, right?
You are correct, Councilman.
Okay.
And the more folks we can get to take advantage of the incentive program, the more people that we can get sidewalks repaired, those who cannot afford it as well. So we want to maximize this incentive program so we can get as many sidewalks repaired as quickly as possible.
But it's certainly an important point. It ought to be integrated fully, and not only into the committee report, but into the implementation of the policy as well.
Mr. Price?
Well, first of all, gentlemen, thank you for your work on this. This is a real basic quality of life issue, and I want to echo comments made by my colleagues, Councilwoman Martinez and Paul, because the fear is that underserved areas are just going to be left out or pushed further back. And so, we don't want the fact that while some communities could take advantage of this incentive and the matching, we don't want that to take precedence over the normal, or rather the regular assignment of work in an equitable way citywide, making sure that our sidewalks, that all the sidewalks get done in a contemporaneous time together. But I've got a question. How is lot, we refer to the lots, how is that being defined? Does it refer to multiple parcels that are tied together, or can an individual with multiple parcels that haven't been developed apply for a rebate for each parcel? How does that play out?
Well, Mr. City Attorney, I'll defer to you because the ordinance goes ahead and talks about. Go ahead.
Yeah, the ordinance, which we'll discuss on item number 2, authorizes the sidewalk incentive repair program that we're talking about here. The term lot is defined in the municipal code already in section 6200 as a lot, parcel, or area of land developed or to be developed as a unit. We do believe it would cover that situation as you described, where the lots are tied together for that single use. One of the things that we've done in the ordinance authorizing the program is we've left the operational details to the Board of Public Works or its designee, in this case, likely the Bureau of Engineering, to spell out the specific qualifications. All we've said is it's available to the owner of a lot. All of the other working details, we're allowing the Bureau to implement and to develop those rules and regulations.
Well, I would just hope that we're going to be very aggressive in promoting the matching program, the reimbursement program in all areas, and maybe some even special emphasis in underserved areas, because again, we want to encourage people to take advantage of it. And some are able to, they just might not be aware and might not understand how it works, and might not understand how it does complement the other efforts that are going on. So I just think public information is going to be real key in the success of this program. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We plan on having a special meeting with all the council offices to really help on the outreach and communication plan along with the mayor's office. So Councilman Price will be asking for all of your assistance in that outreach.
Thank you. So again, just to reiterate and to clarify that once this program's up and running and it's live, this is on a first-come, first-served basis. And I want to like to hear what the department's goals in outreach and education of once this program's up and running.
We want to start with working through our public affairs office in the Department of Public Works. Who's going to be taking the lead and assisting us on communication, along with the council offices and the mayor's office. What we want to do is really drive a lot through social media, through all your outreach. We want to, all your email list and so forth. We want to drive it very much in that fact. We obviously would like to do some press events to promote it, and they're working on those details of those plans, but we really feel that you have a great network there that we want to push big time through your offices, through the neighborhood councils, through the business improvement districts. Everywhere possible is to push this out, to let people know how straightforward and simple it is to do in our 311.
And we have to also be concerned of fraudulent licensed contractors. Would that be part of the whole messaging and marketing of the program as well?
When they come in to obtain the permit, they have to show that they're licensed contractors. So we'll be able to check at that point and verify that they are licensed before they obtain their permit.
And for the disabled, say if I'm a resident with a disability, what do I need to do to get into the queue to fix my sidewalk?
You'll be able to contact 311, and we're working with the information technology. They'll be able to take it over the phone, so you don't have to go online to type it in. So we'll be able to take. We'll also have some additional, phone numbers that people can reach out, and we'll assist them regarding our disabled community. And we're also working with our Department on Disability just in that respect.
Thank you.
It's very important for us, obviously, to make sure that they're able to, if they want to participate in this incentive program, that they can.
Thanks, Gary.
Yep.
On the public works side, any other questions? Yes, Mr. O'Farrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And gentlemen, thank you for the report. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know I'm not the only one that's terribly interested in exploring alternative materials, and this is kind of a once-in-a-generation chance to really take a serious look at that like other cities are doing. So in relation to the 50/50 program, might there be opportunities to certify alternative materials in advance or early in the program so that we may be able to take advantage of alternative materials other than Portland cement? And I think that there's a value in exploring that vis-a-vis our urban canopy with tree root pruning and removal of some of the more mature trees. There might be a way around that, and that could be a component that could maybe even be less expensive and more environmentally friendly, and may be able to help preserve our urban canopy and some of the more mature trees. So that's one question. And then what happens if or when if there's a cap, because it's such a smash hit that we have thousands and thousands of requests, and we haven't budgeted enough funding for the match. Have you thought about that consideration?
First we'll be coming back to you on alternative materials. We'll be reporting back to you on that. As far as how we have a budget that you've established for us of approximately $6.2 million, and we'll be keeping track of that. And so if we had more requests than we do budget, we will stop at the point where we no longer have budget. Next year, we'll see what the budget has for the incentive program. So we'll be monitoring that.
Sure.
And
because
people will stay on the list in the way they queued for the program.
Because I think hitting that balance is going to inform the equity piece as well. So that's a consideration to make, so that we don't head into the territory of, well, the 50/50 program is starting to eat all of our money, so we're not going to quite get to this traditionally underserved neighborhood in time. So I think that's a component of this conversation. Sorry I interrupted you, please.
Oh, no, and I think that's exactly, we want to be able to provide you with data to make those key policy decisions.
And then the alternative materials,
We expect to have that report to you in the next couple of months.
terrific. Thank you.
Mr. Root?
Quick follow-up question to that. You said the program's going to have about $6.2 million budget a year?
It does this year. I don't know about future years.
Oh, okay.
This year.
So whatever it gets allocated, and you said that if it gets to a certain point that you'll stop it. So after we get some more data, if it requires some adjustment, the rebate limits, 2,000 and 4,000, how could we adjust that? Instead of stopping it, can we adjust that number, and how do we do that?
Yes, we're coming to you today with these proposed caps, and once again, we provide you data and so forth, if we're so instructed, we can modify the caps. But once again, as I do a little bit of, if you go to use the incentive program now and the caps are raised or lowered, I mean, if they're lowered, then you got a great deal. If they're raised, it's a concern for the future. But yes, they're not in the ordinance.
And I know in a previous conversation we spoke about you guys are anticipating the whole GIS system to track all of this, monitor this. So how far are you in the progress of that system?
We've just selected the company that will be doing it, and they're going to start the program here next month.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Just on the adjustments, on the budgetary adjustments part of it, what I would expect would happen is if we saw a tremendous surge of engagement, the departments could come back during the FSR process in mid-year. There's already $31 million a year budgeted for sidewalk repair. We have additional money already in the Sidewalk Repair Trust Fund. The well is not going to run dry on this, but it may very much make sense to modify that depending upon how successful it is. It's a supply and demand kind of thing, so we might want to make adjustments, but that will be a policy call that we would have to make after we have a chance to assess the budget through the FSR process in mid-year. That's kind of how I would see it going. And on the alternative materials, just a quick point, because I'm suspecting Mr. Blumenfield is going to want to ask about that too, Mr. O'Farrell, but I just wanted to reiterate that because the Bureau is already working on a full assessment of alternative materials and so on, and that's going to, pursuant to our request, it's going to be an ongoing process. But I do want to emphasize that now, under this incentive program is a great time to begin trying things like that, because it will essentially be, much of it will be on the property owner's dime. And if the property owner is interested in an alternative material that might help preserve a tree, or that might, have a different aesthetic appeal or something, I think it's important that those options be included in the incentive program period, so that the city is not bearing the full cost of that experimentation, frankly. So the sooner we can get those standards developed, Mr. Moore, the more we'll be able to take advantage of those opportunities, I think. Mr. Blumenfield.
Thank you. And that was one of my prime questions as well. And I don't want the alternative materials to trail this ordinance too far, because it'll get going and it'll become an afterthought. And ideally, we'd want to have baked it into this ordinance. I understand it's going to come down the road. And how it would play with the $16 cap is also a question. I mean, what happens if these rubberized, squares are cheaper than Portland cement, and you could actually do it for $16? Then you'll be in the situation where, kind of like turf terminators, where they're going to start offering people free sidewalk repair because they'll take advantage of not a bad thing, of the incentive. How do we deal with that? How do we price the alternatives? Is it tagged at 50% cost, or is it tagged at $16 per square foot? I got a number of questions, but I'll start with that one.
Okay, the way it's going to work is we'll be going out, and more than likely it'll be our Bureau of Contract Administration will be going out and inspecting your sidewalk and giving you an estimate, and then up to, and once again, the cap would be at $2,000 based on how much it would cost for us to do the work. So we would be basing it right now on Portland cement. So, for instance, if you had an alternative material that was approved and we chose to do that, we would then estimate the cost on that alternative material. And then they would be required to install that alternative material. So if the material was less expensive, then we would use a lower rate than concrete.
When you say you use a lower rate?
Well, I mean, for instance, if we go out there, we're not estimating just on a square foot basis. It's a detailed estimate that we provide the homeowner. Like, you have to do some root pruning. You have to, do some curb and gutter repair. You got to, different, at the driveway.
But the reimbursement cost is $16 a square foot?
No.
Or it's 50% of cost?
Up to a cap of $2,000.
Is it 50% of cost, or is it $16 per square foot up to?
I'm sorry. It's a reimbursement of our estimate up to $2,000. So we would go out there and say, for instance, we estimate the work would cost $3,800. Then we would, upon completion of the work, we would pay you we would give you a rebate of $1,900. So there's no invoices that are exchanged between the city and the homeowner.
And what happens if the alternative is not a 20-year alternative?
Well, that's part of what our report will come back to you to consider, because we have to guarantee, right now, the ordinance that's here says that we have to guarantee it for 20 years, and that we only do one repair.
Yes. For residential properties, as we'll discuss for the second item, the warranty period is 20 years or a lesser time, but it's 20 years or one fix. So if the city has to come back in that 20 years, that will...
I guess there's a lot of questions that come up with this policy vis-a-vis the alternative materials, and how that rolls out in terms of, because some of them may not last 20 years, but maybe the property owner is willing to release the liability, or maybe it's a separate deal where we pay this much for the first 5 and this much for the next 5. I can imagine a million scenarios, and I don't see how it fits in with what we're approving today. I see we're approving something, and then we're going to kind of fix it or figure out this piece of it down the road, which is okay. I guess I'm putting a pin in it, as we've all talked about it. It's a really important piece, and it's one that we don't have any details other than what you've discussed. In terms of the overall numbers, I'm not sure how we got the, I heard you say the $4,000 average. Does that $4,000 average include the pruning costs and the tree costs, or is that just simply the cement cost?
No. For instance, for us, when we went out and looked at the almost 400 properties, it had sidewalk repair, it had the driveway path of travel repair, curb and gutter repair, tree pruning, and tree removal and replacement. But it was an average, like I said, of approximately $4,000 when we looked at almost 400 properties.
Right, and I guess there's a little bit of a tension because we want to provide the incentive to as many people as possible, which is the reason for a low cap, but we also want to fix the worst sidewalks first, which could be an argument for a higher cap, or maybe having a higher cap in certain situations, like how we square the ADA issues. If there's an ADA, you talked about earlier, if there's someone who has an ADA issue, they can call 311, and that's how they can get involved if they're the property owner. But what if they're not the property owner? There's an ADA issue. There was a corner on I'll use a hypothetical rather than the real one in my district, but let's say there's an ADA example and of a difficult access point. The property owner wants to do the right thing and fix it and get it done quickly. Wouldn't we want to incentivize that even more to some extent? Is there a way to weight that?
In implementing the program for this year, we did not anticipate doing that. We did it on a first-come, first-served basis. It's the balancing act of the complexities and the number of staff required to do that. So this year we had proposed to do it on a first-come, first-served basis. So that's how we've done it. We did not start on the incentive program. We did not start to break it down and start to ask more detailed questions. It was just on a first-come, first-served basis. Yeah. Because it really is, we were looking at balancing the cap and the number of people who could participate. It's, I understand your concern, and for that reasons, we went with the first-come, first-served right now.
Right. I mean, I guess there are more complexities we can bake in as we move forward on some of this. Even things like a corner lot. Corner lot should have theoretically double the sidewalks, right? But there's nothing. We haven't made any accommodations for that kind of thing.
No, we said all residential. The cap was $2,000. Whether, like you said, corner lot, we would expect it to have double the amount of frontage on concrete, but we did not add any additional for corner lots.
Right. And I guess I'd want to put a pin in that, exploring how we, depending on how this program gets filled, how we might either increase the cap or weight an increase for the cap. Another question: the $6.2 million overall for the program, is that split between actual rebates and cost of processing payments, issuing permits, conducting inspections involving urban forestry? How does that break down in terms of the cost?
Yes, staff costs will also be involved in the incentive program, paying for staff costs that have to administer the program.
Is there any sense you can give us about the amount of that, the percentage that would be going to actual rebate versus all the other costs?
I'd have to get back to you on exactly that, and it also depends on the number of requests we get.
Okay, so I'd like to get a report back on that and how it is ultimately broken down. An important issue.
Yeah, that's some of the reasons that we started this program, with trying to minimize the amount of staff required to implement a program around 469 square miles as the city of LA. And so you're exactly right. We were trying to look at ways to minimize staff costs and get as much out to the owners of properties.
Great. Some additional questions, but I'll yield to my colleagues for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bonnet?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Blumenfield asked most of what I was going to ask very thoroughly. Thank you. I'm disappointed that we're not having the alternatives discussion now. I'm not referring to you here, Gary, but I've been frustrated in this process that every time we've asked about alternatives, it's often felt like the level of enthusiasm among some of the departments is the same as a 4-year-old being asked to eat their Brussels sprouts. And I think the level of enthusiasm on the committee and the council has been really high to do the alternatives. And I think a lot of these policy discussions now would be easier, because I think some of us are afraid we're locking ourselves into some stuff, the 20-year that may conflict with the alternatives and stuff like that. Because we may get to a point where, given the additional benefits of the alternatives, that it may mitigate some of the heat island effect, it may make it less necessary to remove trees. Maybe we want to incentivize that more, just as we were incentivizing different landscaping and stuff like that. It may be something we want to do, so I wish we were doing that now. I'm confused still, the same line of questioning Mr. Koretz had about the funding of the additional trees that may be removed. In the initial language that was in the report that before the substitute motion, was it the intention to do the $2,000 plus the cost of the tree, or was the cost of the tree included in the $2,000?
In our staff report, we had recommended that the homeowner, if a tree was removed, the homeowner would have to replant and maintain the tree, and the second tree would be planted and maintained at the cost from the sidewalk program.
So they would get the rebate, and then the city would
have to plant and pay for the second tree. The city would.
And under the amended version we're considering now, we're silent on that.
We're going to report, so for instance, if 2 trees have to be taken out, we'll keep track of those. The homeowners would plant the 2 trees. The other 2 trees, we would keep a record of that and come back to you with how many trees we have to plant and the costs associated with those trees, and the costs associated with planting and maintaining those 2 additional trees.
So if I were doing this, alternatives aren't covered yet, so if I were doing this, I was eager for the incentive, I'd go through the process, I'd go through the application, you do the assessment, and you would tell me that I would need to remove this tree, replace it with 2. Part of my estimate would be the cost of replacing or installing 2 trees, right?
Only one tree. You will only be responsible as part of the incentive program to replace the 1 tree if it had to be removed.
Okay, because those are 2 different things. The first, at first, I thought it was we were watering, from my perspective, watering down the incentive a bit by not paying for the second tree and making the homeowner do it. Now we're saying the second tree doesn't go in at all?
That is correct. In the amended...
No, it doesn't change the policy. It doesn't change the policy on
It's
the
just-
requirement of the second tree.
It's just
It's
when
who pays for it.
And when is it planted? When? So, yeah, I think that's it. We're keeping track of the second tree that must be planted.
But you're saying the second tree doesn't go in?
Not immediately until we report back to you.
That I'm
The
not comfortable.
requirement of the second tree, just as it is now, remains unchanged, correct?
Yes.
Because that's not what I'm hearing from you. I heard you say yes to that, but what I heard you say is the second tree isn't going to go in, and we're going to keep a list of where the second trees need to eventually go.
And report back into this and back into City Council.
So if I'm repairing my sidewalk 3 months from now, I'm not putting the second tree in when I'm repairing the sidewalk, is what I'm hearing you say.
You are correct. As I understand, so we go out to your house, and unfortunately that tree has to be removed. We will require you to plant a tree in that location. The second tree, we will keep that information. We'll be coming back to you to see where the funding is going to come from to plant that second tree.
Isn't the funding, if we're not having me plant the second tree now, and we're deferring that planting until the city decides how to fund the planting of that tree, aren't we going to have to tear up the whole sidewalk again to put the second tree in?
Not in that location. We wouldn't necessarily, right now you, quote, only had 1 tree in front of your property. The second tree, talking with the Bureau of Street Services and Assistant Director Ron Lorenzo, that second tree we'd have to find a second location for it anyways. It most likely would not have been planted in front of your home. So we're not planting 2 trees in front of your home when there was only 1 tree to begin with.
And that's the case now. The second
That is
tree,
correct.
Mr. Lorenzen, do you want to come up and speak to this? The second tree is usually planted at another location to be determined anyway.
Good afternoon, everybody. Ron Lorenzen, Assistant Director, Bureau of Street Services. As the city engineer has tried to indicate, and I'm going to try to paraphrase what I think is happening here. By the way, I haven't seen that document with the amended recommendations, and that would help me. If I could see that, I'll read that in just a second. Typically, as Councilman Krikorian has indicated, if you're going to take 1 tree out in front of your home, most residential areas, there's not room for 2 replacements. If we use that as my base scenario, and what we are suggesting is, in fact, that in the original report, it said that the homeowner would be responsible for the first tree at their location, if there's room to plant it, and the second tree, the city would replant at a location that we would determine at the Bureau of Street Services. In the revised recommendation, I believe what it's saying is that second tree that we're assuming there's not room for at the property will not be planted until the city determines the funding and the mechanism for planting that tree. Is that correct, Councilman?
All right, well, I think like Mr. Koretz, I prefer the original language on the trees.
If I may, Councilman, I would say is, and I apologize if I've confused it, it was never the intent that the homeowner would have to plant the second tree. It was always the intent that the city would plant the second tree. And I believe what the only clarifying on this is to not just use the incentive money for it, but to report back, and then the council can give us decision, is the money going to come from the incentive program or another funding source? But the intent is to put as much into repairing the sidewalks. So the second tree will be planted, but it's a matter of where the funding will come from.
And
So there's no not planting the second tree.
The
Sorry,
main
Councilman.
concern here is that what we're talking about with this incentive program is budgeted in a subset of the $31 million that we've allocated to guarantee accessibility of our sidewalks to the disabled and senior community. If we make that decision now, how much in the current program, the current repair program that's going on right now in front of city adjacent properties, how much of that program is being expended on trees
To date, we've done,
as a percentage?
I can't give you a percent, but I can tell you we've removed 33 trees on 173 sites so far.
Well,
So, and then tree.
if my research was right, it's something like 30% of the total cost so far, right? Is that approximately right for tree repair? Anyway,
I'm sorry, I don't have that
specifics,
exact
the specifics are less important than the underlying point, which is right now, there is no separate budget for planting of those trees, so it must come out of sidewalks.
Right.
So the point is, the trees will be planted, but the policy question we have to make is if we want to reduce what we have to spend on accessibility of our sidewalks, or do we want to find another funding source to pay those trees from another part of the budget as we normally do in our ordinary budgeting process? That's the juxtaposition that we're deciding between.
And are we, just one last question, are we obligated as a consequence of this policy to find a funding source for that, or is another option that the council might consider just not funding the trees? I think that's what I'm afraid of, is that that's also in our universe of possibilities, right?
Which, of course, in every budgetary
Right.
decision we always make, it's always the discretion of the council to do that. But I think that the clear consensus that I've heard from the council has always been that there will not be an alteration of the tree planting replacement formula that we've always engaged in with all of our capital improvement projects. So yes, I mean, I suppose it's feasible, but I think everybody in this room and the council as a whole is pretty committed to the idea that the 2-for-1 replacement is a good idea. It's a question of which pocket you want to pay for it out of.
Okay.
And then Councilman Krikorian, just about your 30%. Of the samples that we've done for the residential, that's where we've estimated that about 30% of the cost will be associated with trees, not on the work we've done to date, but on the
Okay.
residential.
All right. Thank you.
So thank you, you're spot on the 30%.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kretz?
I guess first of all, I think Mr. Bond and I are completely in sync. The trees are part of the sidewalk program. We're committed to have a sidewalk program. I think it all should be one piece of that puzzle. If we do wind up going ahead with this, can we in some way make sure the canopy cost is replaced within a certain number of years, like 3 years of removal? Otherwise, I could see us, especially in leaner times, getting backlogged on replacement of that second tree, and 50 years from now we'll be 30 or 40 years behind in our tree replacement. I certainly would much rather us just include this. It's all part of the same thing. We have a commitment. I don't think we have any legal obligation not to include trees as part of our replacement program. So could that be done? Could we set up a requirement that those trees be replaced within a certain period of time?
Well, there's two different questions. Require that they be replaced, or require the funding source from which the payment will be made for their replacement. Those are two very different issues. I mean, I expect that the replacement will happen, you know, I think we all would expect that the replacement would happen fairly quickly after that repair is made. But the question would be, are you going to pay for it out of sidewalk money, or are you going to pay for it out of general fund money? That's, I guess, the question. And if you pay for it out of sidewalk money, you're paying for fewer sidewalks that provide accessibility to our disabled community, period.
And of course, if at a point we have the extra 30% in the budget, we could always pay to do more sidewalks. I think it's much iffier with trees. I don't think there's that level of commitment that when we run into harder times that we're going to be paying for that extra tree necessarily is our top priority. Whereas the sidewalk program, it's committed. We're legally committed to it. So, I don't know, given the choice, I would rather put back in that original language and commit ourselves to putting in the trees.
Okay.
And I would make such a motion.
Question on that issue is, ultimately, this still has to go to a judge at some point. Is that correct? Some of this, and would that in any way diminish the amount that we're spending on sidewalks if we baked in the cost of the tree?
The incentive program is not part of the...
I guess the incentive program is not, the overall program, you're right.
It's just completely something that the city is doing voluntarily.
Okay, you're right. Thinking on the overall piece.
Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Bloomfield, but yes, but if we've made a commitment of a specific amount of money to spend on a given policy consistent with the terms of a settlement, and we have less money to spend on that policy because of this, that would be something that would be considered by the court, wouldn't it?
I'm not here to speak on the case, and I'm not really actively involved in the litigation.
Okay.
If and when that settlement receives its formal final approval, the city will be committed to do that which the settlement agreement states in terms of our annual expenditure.
I guess it hit me as a red flag, even though I was thinking more globally than just the incentive program, is anything we do that lowers that ultimate 31 million could have a negative impact. You know, that being said, I'm fully on board with we need to get these trees done. I could see spending them from a different source, though, but I want to get it done. Another question. Does urban forestry have the capacity to do all of the inspections that we need done for this kind of incentive program? I worry that it could become a choke point for this program because it is requiring a lot in terms of going out to all these places to make the determination before anybody can take advantage of the program.
Yes, sir, we do. It was in the budget. We have the positions to do that.
It's good to hear. All right.
Mr. Kretz.
A few other unrelated questions to what we were just discussing. One, I've heard that we have a number of really bad sidewalks around some of the expo stations. Are we looking at prioritizing fixing up those so we can have easier access to our expo stops?
We are working on a prioritization system. We'll be working on a prioritization system. We'll put that into the consideration.
Actually, in the second agenda item with the larger ordinance, transit hubs are already considered as a priority. But in addition, if they're adjacent to a metro station, that's Metro's obligation. And one of the parts of this policy was to require other governmental entities to begin enforcing against other governmental entities immediately. So schools, state, Metro, community colleges, federal government, they're all obligated to fix their own sidewalks, and they're all subject to the same ADA liability that we would be. So I think it was our collective expectation that as to those entities, we would begin enforcing immediately and forcing them to start fixing their sidewalks.
That would be great. Also, I've had some constituents ask if they can refuse to have trees removed as part of the sidewalk repair program. Do they have that ability?
In the incentive program, if a property owner chose to maintain the tree in place and the Bureau had determined that in order to repair the sidewalk, the tree would have to be removed because of structural issues and risk, I think we've kind of looked at perhaps asking the property owner to assume the warranty. In other words, the city at that case would not warranty it for 20 years, and the property owner would then take over the responsibility for any future repairs from that tree. Yeah,
We're kind of getting into what will be part of the sidewalk ordinance, item number 2. If a sidewalk, in order to repair a sidewalk, if the tree needs to be trimmed, say the roots need to be pruned, to such an extent that that tree then would become unsafe, at risk of collapse, I'm going to defer to the Bureau, but I'm hazard to guess that they would not allow that tree to remain in place, even if the property owner asked, because we cannot allow a dangerous tree to remain in place if it's been pruned to such an extent in order to fix the sidewalk. If, on the other hand, the tree can be pruned, root pruned, a sidewalk can be built, the tree will remain safe, albeit, in our opinion, more likely to damage the sidewalk during the warranty period. As we have in the ordinance, the property owner then will have the opportunity to request and have that tree remain in place. However, if they choose to do so, then the warranty will no longer apply to that particular sidewalk. But I stress to distinguish between leaving a tree in place that we feel is likely to cause continued damage to the sidewalk versus a tree that will pose an unsafe condition because it has been pruned to such an extent that it could fall over.
And as far as replacement trees and warranties, we're warranting the sidewalks. Will we warranty trees as well?
The warranty, again, in item number 2 for the sidewalk ordinance applies to the sidewalk, not the tree.
So if we put in a replacement tree and it dies, we're not guaranteeing the survival of the replacement trees for any period of time.
The ordinance applies only to the sidewalk.
And Councilman, excuse me, in the case of a property owner wanting to allow a tree to remain, and we have determined that the root pruning required would make the tree in some way unsafe, that property owner could always dedicate more of their private property for meandering the sidewalk and moving the sidewalk onto what is now existing as private property and making the public right-of-way deeper so that the impact on the tree would not be the same and they could retain the tree.
And by the same token, again, this is getting into the second item more than this one, but by the same token, in the implementation standards that engineering will be developing, as I understand it, consideration can be taken to different sidewalk design that will preserve the tree. For example, if you have a 6-foot sidewalk and 2 feet of it is potentially going to cause a damage to a root that would kill the tree, it would be feasible to meander around it within that 6-foot alley, for example. I'm off the top of my head, but engineering will develop other standards like that with the notion that where it is possible to save trees, we're going to do our best to save the trees. Okay, so we have some cards on item number 1 before we proceed to item number 2. So if you'd go ahead and clear the center table, gentlemen, thank you very much. Our first card is John Howland, followed by Jenny Binstock.
Good afternoon. John Howland, Central City Association. Briefly, there's been a lot of discussion about oversubscribing this program, but there's been nothing in the report or discussed about how property owners will be notified about this program and how they can apply to it, be they residential or business owners. As we've done with other large-scale programs the city has done, we ask that the city embark on a plan and an outreach plan to educate, in this case, property owners about this program's availability. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jenny Binstock. I work with Tree People. We're a local nonprofit working to build a climate-resilient LA through expanded canopy coverage and creating more local water supplies. We remain concerned for the health and well-being of our communities, and we want to make sure that streets are more accessible for people. We see a core part of that mission being the protection of residents from heat and air quality-related health emergencies and illnesses. So given that, we're deeply troubled by the proposition to eliminate the city's responsibility for the second tree. We view a 2-to-1 replacement as the bare minimum for ensuring the health of trees and the preservation of the critical life protection services that they offer as we enter into this massive effort to repair sidewalks. Given the cooling, pollution, scrubbing, and human health protection functions provided by these trees, we cannot gamble away our urban forest and risk leaving many vulnerable populations, including the very community that this program is meant to protect, without those important protections, and we hope to work with you on them.
Thank you. Peter Lashen, please come up. Lassen. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lassen.
Thank you. I am here representing the Community Forest Advisory Committee of the city. We have been working on this proposal also with other city departments and are actually supportive of it. 2 things are missing. One, the idea of replacing the trees on a 1-to-1 basis instead of a 2-to-1 is troubling. Mr. Koretz's idea of replacing it by canopy might just work. Replace the tree that within 3 years it will have a canopy equal to what was removed is a good idea. The more troubling part of this is you have required in this legislation a professional sidewalk contractor. I agree with that, but no professionality is required for modifying the tree. And the trees, because it may be that they require root pruning or other modification in order to save them, please include that a professional, if the tree is to be worked on, a professional is to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a great idea. Dr. Molly Rhodes.
Hi, perfect segue on the trees and the trimming and making sure that the quality is there. We would expect to see, just as stump removal is done by city employees, that tree removal would be done by city employees. So you would have your city family that knows how to do that, doing that work. Also wanted to ask on the 311 app, yay, great. But what's the call volume estimate, and what's the staffing capacity now? And also, in our larger all-mutual goal of creating career paths into the city for underrepresented communities in Los Angeles, we all know sidewalks are a perfect place to do that. The city's done it before during the welfare to work years. Sidewalks were where women came into street services in some volume through training programs. So I just want to flag that. Thanks.
Thank you. And our final speaker on the item is Wayne Spindler.
The only guy making sense is CD3, Bloomingfield. Put him in charge of it, because what he sees is that you're going to go back to the federal court in Willits, and they're going to throw all of this crap out that you're trying to do, because you're mixing trees in, and how do you relate trees to disabilities? Canopy cover is protecting disabilities. How? You got to put that in the language. Otherwise, they're going to throw the tree thing completely out of it. You got to spend $31 million a year on the worst sidewalks. Start right over in Alameda, 1st Street, go all the way down to 7th Street. That's the way you got to start with stuff like that, because that place is just falling apart. But you're doing all these jackass things. What you have to do is do what Bob's talking about, and get the money in there and start doing this and fixing these worst sidewalks. So put Bloomingfield in charge, and the rest of you take an unpaid leave of absence, and we'll take care of it.
Thank you. If I can, call on Mr. Rue for a request on a report back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And actually, in light of our discussions, just reminded me of our previous instructions regarding sustainable alternative sidewalks brought up by Councilman Bonin, Bloomingfield, O'Farrell, and several folks, including Councilman Koretz. And instructions 2526 on our previous report, approved by the City Council back in March, I wanted to see if we could add a recommendation that we expedite those instructions for number 2526, and possibly add an additional recommendation to ask the department, BOE, to develop a RFI to gather necessary information from industry experts regarding sustainable alternative sidewalks. That could be taken as a friendly amendment or a friendly recommendation.
Yes, I'm okay with that.
Thank you.
Mr. Kretz?
Yeah, I'd also like to make a motion that we reinstate the previous language on funding for 2-for-1 tree replacement.
Mr. Bonin, did you second that? Yeah. Okay. Okay, that's friendly. Let's go ahead and take a vote. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you re-clarify that motion, the recommendation from?
It was to reinstate the original language on the funding of 2-for-1 tree replacement where trees are removed.
Right.
Yeah, and I would actually request that we not approve that motion in light of all of the arguments that I stated earlier. We're not changing the tree replacement ratio program, but that language would presuppose an obligation before we have any idea how much it would cost, and the only source of funding for it would be the sidewalk program. So,
and I would concur and ask for a no vote on that amendment. I'd like to see how this pans out once the program hits the streets.
But that being said, none of that presupposes that we wouldn't do exactly that. It's just that this motion is only, or the language as it's before you now is only to ensure that we have the information before us before we make that policy choice. So,
what is the motion before us?
did you want to can you restate the motion? Well, I think his motion was to reinstate the old language, which I don't have in front of me to be able to compare with.
Maybe we could have someone come up. I don't think the old language directed us to spend that money. The new language is a clarification. It wasn't a contradiction of the old language. Is that correct?
To replace
Mr. Moore.
Maybe we could read the old language.
The language in the original report the second tree would be funded from the sidewalk, the $6.2 million that you've set aside for the incentive. I believe the motion that was introduced just said, please report back on how many second trees there are, and then the council will give direction whether to fund it from that money or a general fund source.
So just to clarify, originally recommendation number 2, which you have in the substitute recommendations, continued, that sentence continued after the period with this language, and that the city will assume the costs for planting and establishing any additional street trees that are required. That language was stricken, and instead, recommendation number 3 was added, which essentially includes the report back after the program is implemented. So that's the difference. The difference is striking the language and getting the report back regarding assuming all of the costs for planting and establishing any additional street trees. Now, that language does not specify, of course, that funding would have to come from the sidewalk program, but there is no other budget for it. So if we make that commitment now, the only place it can come from is from the sidewalk funds, unless we go through the normal budget process as new recommendation number 3 provides, and then make that decision and find a funding source for it. So that was the reason for it. Okay. Any other comment on the motion? Any other discussion?
Clarification. Can I suggest possibly changing the proposed motion, or do we have to vote on this and then?
You can offer a friendly amendment to the author of the motion if you'd like, the mover.
So I'll just, looking at the original report that we're changing it from is the June 9th report, right? Item number 2?
Yes.
So, I'm concerned. I want trees too. I want to make sure, and I think in the old instruction as well as the new instruction, I think the bigger concern, it's also where is the funding going to come from, and I concur with both chairs. Even though as much as I want these trees, we first got to figure out where the budget's going to come from. But secondarily, I think also, the other secondary concern is, it's not just, because it leaves it vague as when the city finds fit to find a tree. So what if it was something about we asked the department to come back with more of a definitive timeline on when they plan to plant the second tree? Would that help?
So the timing of the planting of the trees is not addressed at all by any of the recommendations before us. So that would be a separate policy discussion I guess we could have, but it has nothing really, or it's not impacted anyway by the incentive program itself. Our tree replacement program is what it is, and so I guess we could do that, but it.
Because if we define the timeline, then we still have to find budget source for it. But it gives us, we're not actually allocating the budget source from the sidewalk program to the tree right now, as proposed by Councilman Krebs.
Mr. Moore, you jumped up here. Did you want to speak to that?
No. I just think, I think we're all very nervous about how the program's going to go. So, we can report back in 3 months about the second tree, and in a very time, give you, or 6 months about the second tree is what you're saying in the motion that you propose. So, that's what we're saying here is in the amended motion is that we would come back and report to you about the second tree and how many second trees there are and the costs associated with that. Okay, so there's 3 things sort of together. I'm not sure how they fuse together here, if at all. So you made a proposal, Mr. Rue. Let me take Mr. Kretz and hear what he thinks about your thought.
I think we're sort of getting at the same thing. I think what we're all uncomfortable with is a weaker commitment towards actually doing the second tree. So if we did wording that said something like, there must be no net loss in trees within 3 years, that could do it, as long as that's pretty much in stone and we meant it, and within 3 years, those second trees get planted.
So if we can do something to ensure that everyone here is satisfied that the second tree replacement policy remains in effect, whether we do it through the incentive program or otherwise, I think everybody would be supportive of that. The concern I have is a very specific one, which is right now there's a fixed amount of money budgeted for sidewalk repair. There is 0 money budgeted for tree replacement in the incentive program of sidewalk repair. So if we if we approved this language, we would be making a budget appropriation today outside of the budget context without a source of funding for it. We never do that on anything. We never make a spontaneous budget appropriation. And that's exactly what we would be doing. The only alternatives are either it's a budget appropriation or it's a reduction in our commitment to sidewalks. It's a zero-sum game. So, but that being said, I think on the substance of the policy, which is where everybody's discomfort is coming from, is there some way that we can guarantee that the second tree replacement policy will be enforced in the sidewalk incentive program without speaking to the funding of it, and then have the departments come back once we have a sense of the scale of it so we can make an intelligent budget appropriation decision? Is there a way we can do that?
We'll be glad to report back in 120 days after the incentive tree. See, it'll take a little bit of time to even find out, because remember, the homeowners, have to apply. We've got to go out. We've got to inspect. Then they have, so many days to get a permit, and then so we could probably, maybe in 150 days after the program starts, report back. It would be about the right time to report back.
And that would be great to have the report back. But the second part of this is, does it make sense, because I'm making this up as I go right now, does it make sense to all of you on substance if we, as part of this policy, make a commitment that the second tree replacement program will be enforced?
Yes.
Now, enforcement might mean that we require the homeowner to pay for it. It might mean that we pay for it out of general fund resources. It might mean that we pay for it out of sidewalk. We remain agnostic on that question, but require that this program will involve a second tree replacement to the same extent it does under ordinary policy right now. Would that be a reasonable resolution that would satisfy folks? Mr. Blumenfield.
I mean, it certainly satisfies me, but I think it could be even simpler to potentially to say nothing in this ordinance, shall limit the city's obligations under the second tree removal policy. That policy will remain in effect for the incentive program and every other program as it continues to do so. Just to clarify that we are not deviating from that program. We still have to meet that second tree obligation, and then we decide where the funding comes from. But I don't see what we're doing here as limiting our obligation anyway, and maybe we need to just be very explicit about it.
Yeah.
Because on the policy, we're all in the same place. We need to have that second tree. It needs to happen as fast as possible. It's just a question of who pays for it.
I mean, think of it in this, a developer right now comes in, takes a tree out. That developer has an obligation to do a 2-for-1 replacement. This is the same situation, except the developer is only fixing the sidewalk, and the developer happens to be the adjacent property owner. It's the same thing, except in this case, we're incentivizing that by giving money to the property owner. So we're not changing in any way what we already do when a home is remodeled, when a shopping mall is built, or anything else. It's the exact same policy that we have on those other things. So if we can reiterate that we, I think you said it very well, Mr. Blumenfield, that nothing in this policy diminishes or alters the current policy of 2-for-1 replacement. I think that's a statement that should be enough. But Mr. Kretz, go ahead.
I think that would work as long as there's a date certain. Because we've obligated ourselves before the settlement to fix sidewalks, yet we're on a previous to our current plans, we were on, I think, a 91-year sidewalk replacement cycle. We could, if we wound up in fiscal hot water, do the same thing with trees. And we'd be in other kinds of hot water if we did that. So if we had some sort of a date certain added to that, I think that would work just fine. Whether it was 2 or 3 years that it had to be done by then, if we can find some way to work that in. Because if it's just an obligation, we might have it, we might keep a list, we might have thousands of trees on that list and be years and years behind. So do we have a way to write that in such a way that that's reflected?
Well, what would it be that must happen within that, whatever the given time period?
Second tree has to be planted within 3 years.
Well, I'd be a little apprehensive about that because we're having trouble right now with the stock of trees that we have that, trying to find places to plant them. And so, I mean, there become practical problems with the urban forest.
Is that feasible?
Okay, Ron Lorenzen again. I don't think the intention of the second tree replacement or in either the access request program or the incentive program was for city staff to perform this function. You're exactly correct, as we do not have the resources to do that. And the intention of this program was to fund this in the most economical fashion we could, utilizing nonprofits for one example, and at-risk youth programs, et cetera, to get this planted. I would, as the person the city looks at to really address the tree issues, if we are not going to have the city take the obligation of planting that second tree in an extremely timely manner, I would suggest that we stick to the 2-to-1 policy and have the property owner plant both of them. That would be my recommendation.
To give it a date certain, I struggle with because we're going into this blindly. I struggle with this moving forward, but given it a timeline. Again, our ultimate goal here, per the litigation, is to fix as many sidewalks as possible. Now, if money grows on trees, then we'd be able to fix everything, including the second tree. Right?
The reason I
In
suggested
fact, if money grew on trees, the more trees we planted, the better.
The better.
Yeah,
Make sure you have a maintenance program to maintain those trees. There's been a lot of nonprofits in my community who plant trees and love to plant them. There's no maintenance to go along with them, so there's a lot of also dead trees.
I don't disagree with that at all. I'm just trying to address the
People
problem
love
in the
to
most...
talk about planting trees in low-income communities, but there is no way of maintaining them.
Quite a different issue, and I totally agree with you. But again, the most economical way for the second tree to be planted is if the property owner would obtain it and plant it.
Correct.
Because they typically would have some method of watering. The issue for the city watering the second tree is in the cost of the watering over a 3-year period to maintain that tree.
Okay. Mr. Blumenfield, were your comments stated as a motion?
Certainly. They weren't, but now they are.
Okay. All right.
But there is a motion on the floor.
Yeah.
So I would either have to do an amending motion, or after that motion, I could offer a second motion.
The most recent motion, I think, if I'm not mistaken, gets voted on first. So if you're making that motion...
Well, unless I did an amending motion, but that doesn't make sense to do, so you can do...
But I don't know, maybe we can see if we can short circuit all this. Mr. Kratz, I want to go to you. Is there anything that you've heard in this discussion that helps to address your concern, or do you want to restate anything differently?
Boy, I'm not sure we quite hit on it with any of our suggestions, but my concern is that we're going to do these sidewalks, we're going to take down mature trees, we're going to put up 1 stick and not even 2 sticks. We're going to dramatically increase the heat island effect in Los Angeles, and we're going to be one hot city at a time that we will not be happy that we've done that to ourselves. This does not seem like a strong enough commitment to actually plant the second trees. So if we can figure out a way that we can word this so we really will be planting the second trees, I'm fine with it. And if it turns out that the property owner has to maintain both trees, I don't see a problem with that. In fact, that might be more logical, because they're already watering 1 tree, they can water 2 trees. But the city, I think, should be committed to doing that second tree, and it should have some sort of a timetable.
Okay, so Mr. Blumenfield has a motion to ensure that the incentive program does not alter the two-for-one replacement policy in existence now. So I guess we can go ahead and start with that, and then we can go to Mr. Kretz's previous motion, which you'll restate it for me in a minute, if you will. But let's go ahead with Mr. Blumenfield's motion.
Don't we have to do his first?
Huh?
Don't we have to do, his is the one on the floor.
I think the most recent one gets voted on first.
Only if it's an amending motion. But I don't care, so go ahead.
I mean, do we have a committee rule on that? Or rule of procedure? Does anyone?
If it was a substitute motion, then it would go
Mr.
first.
Chair,
Yeah.
committee is much more informal than council, so it's at the chair's discretion.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and vote on Mr. Blumenfield's motion first. I guess they're not mutually exclusive anyway, but
I vote, I support the, Mr. Blumenfield's motion, I vote. Do you want to roll call it, Mr. Clerk?
Certainly.
Nothing.
On Councilmember Blumenfeld's motion that nothing in the incentive program diminishes the city's obligation for the two-for-one tree replacement. Councilmember Buscaino?
Aye.
Councilmember Martinez? Aye. Councilmember Price? Aye. Councilmember O'Farrell?
Aye.
Councilmember Rue?
Aye.
And on the Budget and Finance Committee, Councilmember Krikorian?
aye.
Councilmember Englander? Aye. Councilmember Koretz?
Aye.
Councilmember Bonin?
Well, we could have simplified that, I suppose. And for the sake of simplicity of the reporting, can we consider the motions to be considered by the committees as a whole together so that we have one report instead of two reports on these? If there's no objection to that? Okay.
There will be only one committee report.
Okay.
That will be a dual report.
Okay.
No objection.
Okay. Mr. Kretz.
And again, I don't have the language in front of me, but
To-
you cited it to reinstate the previous language.
Okay, so the pending motion is, Mr. Kretz's motion is to revert to the original language of the memo dated June 9th, rather than and I guess to reject the substitute recommendations that are before us. So that's the motion that's before us. So call the vote, please.
On the Public Works Committee, Councilmember Buscaino?
No?
Councilmember Martinez? No. Councilmember Price? No. Councilmember O'Farrell? No. Councilmember Rue?
No.
On the Budget and Finance Committee, Councilmember Krikorian?
No.
Councilmember Englander? No. Councilmember Koretz? I'm sorry, Councilmember Blumenfeld?
No.
Councilmember Bonin? Yes. Okay. The motion does not pass.
Did Mr. Kretz get a chance to vote?
No.
Mr. Koretz's vote was not included.
Okay.
I think you can assume my vote.
All right, then on the matter as presented, item number 1, yes, as amended by the report back request that Mr. Rue had suggested. Were there any other friendly amendments? With the inclusion of this concerns that Ms. Martinez had expressed and
An RFI. RFI for alternative materials.
okay, is there objection to proceeding with that vote? I mean, we can call a roll call on budget and finance if you'd prefer. Why don't we go ahead and do that? Let's call a roll call on budget and finance. There's no objection on Public Works, but on the underlying matter, item number 1?
On the overall matter?
Yes.
With the amendments by Council Members Martinez, Councilmember Blumenfeld's request for report back. And I believe
Councilmember Rue had a report back request as well.
and Councilmember Rue's report back.
Yes.
Okay.
No objection. Works side? Would you have a voice vote?
Let me go ahead and take a voice vote. Public Works Committee, Councilmember Buscaino.
Aye.
Councilmember Martinez. Aye. Councilmember Price. Aye. Councilmember O'Farrell.
Aye.
Councilmember Rue.
Aye.
Councilmember Krikorian.
Aye.
Councilmember Englander. Aye. Councilmember Koretz. Aye. Councilmember Blumenfeld.
Aye.
Councilmember Bonin. Aye. The item is approved.
Very good. Thank you, members, very much. Thank you, gentlemen, for that report and for all of your terrific work on developing a very, very difficult, challenging policy. We appreciate your efforts very much. All right, that brings us to item number 2.
Item number 2 is a city attorney report and ordinance relative to amending the Los Angeles Municipal Code, Section 62.104, to return the repair and maintenance of sidewalks, driveway approaches, curb returns, and curbs to property owners, provide a fix and release program for the repair and maintenance of sidewalks, and to authorize a sidewalk repair warranty program and a sidewalk repair incentive program.
All right. I don't know that it's necessary to give much of a report. This is the city attorney's draft ordinance encapsulating the policy that's previously been approved by the council. But there are questions from some members and cards from the public. So I want to start, if I can, with Ms. Martinez.
Thank you, Mr. Krikorian, and I'm sorry I'm going to have to leave early. I have a meeting upstairs, but I wanted to ask a few questions before I leave. So with the $20,000 cap, would this mean that locations with extensive damage won't be able to get repaired under Willits? That's the way I read it, the way I understand it. So that's my first question.
No. First of all, taking a step back, the council instruction to our office to prepare the ordinance included an instruction to prepare a cap, per parcel cap. Working with the city engineers working group, the dollar amount of $20,000 was identified as an appropriate level for the cap. The ordinance that you have before you, including the cap, in no way limits the city's ability to comply with the Willits settlement. It's simply the reflection from the council's policy statement that when we set out to repair a sidewalk, there's a cap on how much the city will spend, so that those most damaged sidewalks that would be the most expensive to repair don't absorb a disproportionate share of the city's available funding. We've prepared the ordinance in such a way so that if the Bureau of Engineering identifies a sidewalk that is in need of such extensive repair that it is estimated to cost over $20,000, we will first let the individual property owner essentially have the first chance at repairing that sidewalk. If the property owner does not want to avail themselves of that opportunity, then the city will go ahead and repair that sidewalk in full, and any amount in excess of that cap, the $20,000 cap, will then be the responsibility of the property owner. And I also would like to point out that the $20,000 cap is estimated to cover all or virtually all residential properties, and that dollar amount will be adjusted for inflation each year.
And the reason I ask is because in my district, we've gotten various cost estimates for repairs, and sometimes they exceed anywhere between $25,000 to $35,000 range. That's why I ask, because essentially I'm worried about excluding the worst of the worst, and there's got to be a plan for those homeowners because it's not their fault. It just happens to be a very extensive repair cost, and I want to figure out a plan for them as well. So the only thing, Mr. Chair, that I ask is I want a report back on the effects of this $20,000 cap from the BOE and the CAO's office to monitor annual project cost, to see if the cap threshold needs to be increased in order to ensure that all the properties are eligible for repair under the Willits settlement. Is that good?
Yes.
Okay. That was essentially, okay, great, thanks.
Any objection on our side? Seems reasonable. All right. Anything else, Ms. Martinez?
That's it. Thank you. I have to run upstairs.
Any other questions? Mr. Blumenfield?
Very narrow questions, but the ordinance uses different terminology than the existing ordinance in the Highway Code, Section 5610. I want to understand why there's a difference. The ordinance speaks about property owners' responsibility for sidewalks that are on a lot and a lot containing the sidewalk, but in most cases the sidewalks are fronting on or adjacent to or abutting the lot, but are actually in the public right-of-way. And it may all just be a semantical issue, but I wanted to see if this was a drafting issue or if there was a choice here and what the meaning of that choice was.
Well, first of all, so this section 62104 does fit within the larger municipal code, so we are using terminology that's consistent in the municipal code. There's really no intent to deviate from deviate in a substantive way from the street and highway code in that regard. In fact, in many situations, a parcel of real property actually goes out to the center line of the street, and then laying on top of that is the city's easement. But there's no intent to deviate from the street and highway code, the language on versus abutting. We view that as synonymous in this situation. We'll, however, take a careful look at it, and if we feel that it can be clarified, we'll do so. But as it stands right now, we feel the language is sufficient.
So whether your lot's technically adjacent or on, the policy remains the same.
Correct, and I believe that is fairly well expressed in the council file history on this.
Okay, and then another sort of very narrow thing. The existing ordinance and state statute include language requiring property owners to maintain sidewalks, quote, in a condition which will not interfere with the public convenience in the use thereof. This language was not in the proposed ordinance, and just trying to understand why, again, if there's an intent there, should we track the exact language, or is there a choice that we're making?
Well, we are operating in the environment as a result of the pending litigation. We feel that if we maintain the sidewalks and bring them up to the standard of the Americans with Disabilities Act, we will, in fact, be serving the highest possible standard. And so we feel this is the appropriate language to use. We recognize, though, the Street and Highway Code differs in that regard, but nevertheless, we are under certain obligations, and so we drafted the language in accordance to comply with the ADA.
So your view is that it actually keeps us at a higher standard than
we feel that the ADA standard is the most appropriate standard.
Okay. Is there a difference?
No, perhaps it's semantics on my part.
Okay. Okay, and then the other question I think we've covered about sort of the multiple lots and how that works. But I think we'll work that out. So, great, thank you.
Certainly.
Anything else? Mr. Kress? Mr. Okay, we have a few cards. Our first is Jonathan, thank you very much, gentlemen. Our first card is Jonathan Herrera, followed by Jenny Binstock.
Good afternoon. Jonathan Herrera from the Valley Industry and Commerce Association, VICA, representing over 400 local businesses and nonprofits across Los Angeles. And this may also be able to be implemented with the first item, but this does cover the second. VICA supports with amendments the Sidewalk Repair Program draft ordinance. The Sidewalk Repair Program is necessary for Los Angeles, but the following provisions should be included to ensure the program meets the intended goal of the ordinance. Tree removals should be for the purpose of prevention or repair of sidewalk destruction on public or private property should be by right of the property owners. There should be allocated staff to oversee the process. Thirdly, the city should create a list of pre-qualified private contractors, which was in the first one, to be sent out to property owners. Fourthly, the city should assume liability during the interim periods between a property owner's request for approval and when the actual when the approval is given. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jenny Binstock, followed by Peter Lassen.
Hello again, Jenny Binstock from Tree People. We're glad to see that the urban forest is accounted for in the draft ordinance instituting the fix and release component of the sidewalk repair program. However, we believe the language could more explicitly reflect the critical value of trees and our urban forest to Angelinos. Specifically, we would urge the city in the development of fix and release to ensure that UFD has adequate resources and time to respond to necessary repairs, If UFD does not have sufficient resources to oversee the evaluation of trees and any subsequent root pruning or site adjustments, there will obviously be further unnecessary loss of canopy. So as we move to have the city adopt fix and release policy, both UFD and city contract administration needs the long-term and sufficient staffing to oversee homeowner permits and repair the sidewalk and prevent unnecessary damage. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Peter Lassen, followed by Wayne Spindler.
Hello again. I'm Peter Lassen. I'm representing the Community Forest Advisory Committee. I would like to note that nowhere in either of these pieces of legislation are the importance of saving the trees. And it really should be at least somewhere in the report. It is essential that we try to save those trees, especially the old growth trees and the large canopy trees. To note, maintenance should also be included in the funding for these projects. I will tell you, it looks like urban forestry is going to need some funding for more staff. One would expect that that's probably right. But generally, we are supportive of this. This is not a fight between trees and disabled people. It is for trees and sidewalks. So, both. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Our next speaker is Wayne Spindler, followed by Herman, and that's the last card on this item.
The pig will address.
I am in favor of trees. Trees are needed by people, and trees are needed by animals. When you cut these fucking trees down, make sure there are no bird nests in the top of the tree. You need a certified arborist before you can take down a tree, because birds' nests are in those trees, and you are not allowed to cut down a fucking tree or trim it until the birds are safe. Tweet, tweet, yes. And that's why when dogs go down and they do their business, they only can do it next to a tree. So for the birds, for the trees, and for the pigs, make sure you save all city trees unless absolutely necessary. If they're found dead by an arborist, if they're not, save the fucking trees. Thank you.
Herman?
So now you're in violation of the American Disability Act, because once again, this city does not protect individuals with disabilities from service, programs, or activity under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and amended by 29 U.S.C. 794, you jackasses. Leave the trees alone, work around the trees, let Pepita Pig and all her friends have trees like the Eagles, and then again under 28 CFR Part 35, once again, you continue to violate our rights under the American Disability Act, and over with my reference number 100038158 for the record, in complaint to reference 16BRIZG 2P15. I can't wait till DOJ comes in here and gets you morons to do your fucking job and stop taking the taxpayers' money, morons.
All right. That closes comment on this item. Is there any objection to approval of item number 2 from any member of either committee? There being none.
Excuse me,
Mr. Williams.
Chair.
Yes.
That would be as amended by Councilmember Martinez's request for report back.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. It will, without objection. And so it looks like there's no objection. That will be approved by both committees. Yes. And so the joint meeting is now adjourned. Thank you all very much. Good work, everyone.